Hey guys, Steven here. And yes, this is a live stream, so nothing's perfect, but oh well, it's okay. But today we're going to learn about the pentatonics. I always start by playing that song Green Tea, but it's kind of appropriate here because most of that song, most of that melody especially, and then basically up to that point is using the G pentatonic scale. But I did a video earlier this month where basically we were going over pentatonic scales as well, and we did them in different positions all the way up the neck. So I'm going to recap that really quickly. That was the first position, second position, third position, fourth position, fifth position, and then it would start over up here. And the reason I'm playing that one up there, like I didn't in the video, but the reason I'm playing that one right there is so that you can see the pattern without the open strings in it. So that's the E minor pentatonic scale. It's also the G major pentatonic scale. So if you play it in that open position, then it sounds more like E minor, especially if you start on an E and end on an E and just do part of that position. So it kind of sounds minor. And then when you go to the next position, if you just took that much out of it and didn't do the last two notes, you'd have a G major pentatonic scale, just one octave of it. So you can kind of hear that it sounds like the song My Girl, and it's used in a lot of other songs as well. That's just one that uses it straight up. And then the other ones are all just different variations. But basically, when we're doing each position, the way they're determined is by starting on a different note of the particular pentatonic scale you're doing. So the way that you would find out those positions in any key is you would start on the lowest note that you can on the bass from that particular scale. So let's say we were doing the G major pentatonic scale, but we have an E in that scale, G, A, B, D, E. So we can start on literally an open E string. And that's why I'm starting that one there, even though I'm thinking of it as the G major pentatonic instead of the E minor. That's kind of what I'm doing there. So anyway, what we could do then is it's basically the E minor pentatonic scale, but we could play it on one string. So then we have this like linear idea of the scale where it's all just laid out in front of you in one single line. And for the record, that's E, G, A, B, D, E, as played all on the E string, open E, 3rd fret on the E string, 5th fret, 7th fret, 10th fret, and then you're at the 12th fret after that. So that's what we want to do first, learn how to play that pentatonic scale on one string. Let's hope I played what I said. There you go. So we've got that pentatonic scale. So now what we want to do is basically learn how to do one octave of either the G major or the E minor pentatonic and learn that pattern going across strings. So instead of doing it all in one string, right, you can keep going if you want to. You can do that across 3 strings instead. So we could go 2 notes per string, E, G. So that's open E string and the 3rd fret on the E string. Then we go to the A string, we play the open A string. And then the 2nd fret on the A string is B. So that one's in scale as well. And then we go D, E on the D string, the open D string. And then we have an E there. So because we're starting on that E, and yet we're doing the notes of G major pentatonic, this is kind of hard to explain. I'm leaving out some theory here, but just know that that is the relative minor. So that was why it's E minor pentatonic is the same as G major, just you're starting on a different note. But it's the same set of notes. E, G, A, B, D, E. Or you could think of it this way, G, A, B, D, E, then you're back to G there. So it's like it's the same letters. It's the same sharps and flats, which in this case is no sharps and no flats for this pentatonic scale. Okay, so then you can learn that octave, right? Starting on an E and ending on an E. But then you notice we still have an extra string down below. We could play a couple more notes in that position. So this position is just from open to the 3rd fret. So all we would do is just keep going up the scale, adding those letter names. We have an E, a G, an A, a B, a D, and an E. Well, we need another G. There's an open G string below. Okay. And then we need another A. 2nd fret on the G string is an A. So we could play all those notes in that single position. And that's how we get those positions for the pentatonic scale. So with the next one, this pattern, we're doing the same thing. I'm doing 1 finger per fret here. So I've got these 4 frets, and then I'm assigning my fingers to them. That makes sense? So basically, my index finger is getting all the 2nd fret notes. My middle finger is getting the 3rd fret notes. My ring finger is getting the 4th fret notes, and my pinky is getting the 5th fret notes. So using that grid, how many of these same notes that we mentioned before, either an E, a G, A, B, D, or E. So if you can remember those notes, you may want to write them down somewhere. How many can we find in this position? So in this grid. And that will give us that pattern. So here, we're starting on a G. Then we have an A, right, on that string. So those 2 in that position. Then on the next string, we're looking for a B note and a D note next. Well, there's a B, there's a D. And that's the 2nd fret on the A string and the 5th fret on the A string. And then we're going to go to the D string. And we'll play the 2nd fret on the D string and the 5th fret on the D string. And that gets us 1 octave of the G major. So G, A, B, D, E, G. But then we could keep going because we have another string below here. And so we're just going to use the other notes that we know down here. So that's going to be an A and a B. So we've got G, A, B, D, E, G, A, B. So all of those notes are in that position. And that's how we came up with that one. Okay. Now look at the way this pattern looks on these strings, right? Because we can move this pattern around and get all the other major pentatonic scales just by starting on a different note and using that pattern. So this one is going middle to pinky. Then on the next string, we're going index pinky. Then the next string, we're going index pinky. Then we're going to go index finger, middle finger. Sorry, index finger, ring finger. Let me say it again. Middle, pinky, then the next string, index, pinky, next string, index, pinky, then index, ring. So hopefully that kind of gives you the idea of what that pattern is. And that's basically the root position of the major pentatonic scale. Okay. So now we've got that. We're going to move up to the next note in the scale. So if we were doing this all on one string, remember, our next note is going to be the 5th fret on the E string, which is an A. So if we're starting on an A and we're trying to get as many notes in one position as we can, if you put your pointer finger on the A, you realize I can get A and B, and that's fine. But if you keep going through the scale, you're going to realize, oh, there's a note that I could get over here if I had just been in this position the whole time instead. So why don't we start on this A note with our middle finger, and then we end up with this pattern. So on the E string, we've got the A and the B. On the A string, we've got the D and the E. And then on the D string, we've got a G, and then we're back to an A. And it's like, okay, the next note would be B. And we're like, oh, if we were here, we'd have to reach over there to B. But if we're here, we can stay in the same position to play B. And then we have a D up here. So look at this one. This is starting on the 2nd note of whatever pentatonic scale you're on. So you could think of this one over here as being this. It's kind of hard to say it that way, but this is really the first position of a major pentatonic scale, and this is really the second position of it because we're starting on the second note of the scale. But since we were doing the E minor and G major, when we started on E, I was calling that position 1. Okay, so we've got that one I'm calling position 2, but that's the root position of that pentatonic scale. Then we can go here. So basically what I'm doing there is starting on the second note of the scale. Second, third, fourth, fifth, but it's hard to say it that way. I want to think of it in terms of the major scale, not the major pentatonic scale. So it gets kind of confusing here. So I'm thinking of this as, if you know your intervals, I'm thinking of this as the first note of scale. So it's like this is a second, then from here to there is a third, from here to there is a fifth, from here to there is a sixth, from here to there is the octave. So I'm thinking of it more that way when I'm coming up with this. So I'm saying this is the root position of the scale. This is starting from the second. Then the next note would be starting from the third. You end up with this pattern. And it's good to memorize these patterns. So if you're starting on the root position, you start on your middle finger and you go middle pinky, index pinky, index pinky, index ring, right? So memorize that pattern just one at a time. Do this because that means if you want to do a root position pentatonic scale of any other of them, you could use that same finger layout and just move your middle finger to whatever scale you want to play. So if you start on a G, it's the G major pentatonic scale. If you start on, I don't know, something up here, the 9th fret, you'd end up with a C sharp major pentatonic scale. If you started on the 7th fret, you'd end up with a B major pentatonic scale. But anyway, so that's how you do that. But let's digress back to just doing the G major pentatonic scale in its different positions. So we have this one, which is basically the E minor position. Then we have this one, which is the G major. But now when we move up to the second note of the scale, we end up with this pattern, which is middle pinky, move down a string, middle pinky, move down a string, middle pinky, and then we've got index pinky on the bottom. So that's that position. And then now we're going to move to the third note of the scale. And when I say the scale, I'm talking about the major scale for a second, even though we're playing pentatonics. So this is a third away from the root, if you know your intervals. Okay. So we're going to go from index to pinky. Then we're going to go to the next string, index pinky. Then we're going to go to the next string, go index ring. And then go to the next string and do index ring. Okay. And so that's starting from the third away from our root of the scale. So the next note is our fifth away from the root, even though it's only the fourth note of the scale. I'm going to tell you based off of like intervals. So if our root is G and we're starting on a D, we're starting on the fifth. So this is the position starting on the fifth, yet it's not the fifth note of the scale, if that makes any sense. It's a little confusing, I know, but it looks like this. And the notes there would be D, E, G, A, B, D, E, G. Those. So that's middle pinky, go down a string, middle pinky, go down a string, index pinky, go down a string, index pinky. And then we would be back to an E, so we could use this same pattern. But since we did it with open strings there, we're going to have to use different fingers here. So if we were doing the grid, which I know you're kind of cramming your fingers in there, so you may decide to play it differently, but I'm going to tell you how to do it based on if we were using the grid. Obviously, if you don't have a cutaway, you would probably reach your fingers over, maybe reach your thumb up to do this and use different fingers. But just going by what the grid would dictate, we could play our index finger on the 12th fret. Our pinky would get the 15th fret there. So that's an E and a G going to an A to a B. So that's going to be index ring on the A string, then index ring on the D string, then index ring on the G string too. Now, the reason we're doing that is because when we try doing pentatonic scales in other keys, that part of the scale won't fall on the open. So that won't be in this position. So we'll have to use kind of our fingers in that formation when we get to that. So it's a little confusing, but those are the positions of G major. You can do it starting from an E, starting from a G, starting from an A, starting from a B, and then starting from a D. So I'm going to say the names of the notes, and you're going to hear that it's the same notes over and over. It's the same 5 notes. They're just cycling in a different, they're going in the same order. You're just starting on a different one each time. E, G, A, B, D, E, G, A. So you hear how that at the end it did E, G, A again. E, G, A. It started with E, G, A. But there are only 5 different notes. E, G, A, B, D. E, G, A, B, D. Okay, so if we start here, we have G, A, B, D, E, G, A, B. So same notes, just doing all of those different 5 that we can play under those 4 fingers when they're here. So next we have this one. A, B, D, E, G, A, B, and D. Right? So if we do that, we're not starting on a G, we're not starting on an E. Those would be the minor pentatonic scale of using this formation notes, or the major pentatonic scale if we started on G. But this is like, you could think of it as a mode of the pentatonic, but we're once again playing everything in the position, so I wouldn't even think about it that way. So this is just another position of playing it. Okay, but get those patterns memorized, because when we play all the notes of a different pentatonic scale, the patterns are going to end up being the same based off of what note you're starting on within the scale. So we said root, second, third, fifth, or sixth. So the root pattern looks like this. So in other words, if you're in the G major pentatonic scale and you're starting on a G, that's what the pattern's going to look like. If you're starting in the G major, but you're starting on an A, you're starting on the second note of the scale, or the second away from the root, rather. Let's do that. And then when you go to the third note of the scale, you're starting on B. That's also a third away from the root. Okay, that's going to be the pattern. So just kind of like going through these slowly. If you have to watch this again, or if you want to go through my video from earlier in the week, it kind of covers all of that. Okay, so then we have the one starting on the 5th. And when I say the 5th, this isn't the 5th note of the pentatonic scale. This is a 5th away from G. G, A, B, C, D. So we don't have a C in the pentatonic scale, but we're still calling this the 5th. So this is the position built off of the 5th, meaning a 5th away from the root, not the 5th note of the pentatonic scale. Okay, and that's the pattern you'd use for that. And then when you do the 6th note of the scale, this is the 6th away from the root, that's going to be our minor pentatonic shape. So I know I was talking about the notes as we were going up. It's still the same set of notes. E, G, A, B, D, E, G, A. Same 5 notes. They're just cycling around from a different place. Okay. So that's what we're doing there. And then you have basically the reason we would do that instead of just learning it linearly, like, is 1, you get more range from doing that, right? From low to high. But 2, you can play a lot of those notes in one position. So if you're soloing, you can kind of like get a lot of like fluidity, right? And then you can move to another position. Right? And then right, so you get a lot of notes out of just that one position, and if you practice those patterns a lot, you can improvise using that. And then there's two more. And then I know I'm not using the right fingers up there, but like I said, because they get so crammed together, you might decide to use different fingers as well, but it's still the same position overall. Okay, so why did I go through all of that and go through all of calling this the root, this the second note, this the third, that's the fifth, that's the sixth, and saying our positions start on that? Well, let's take an example of another scale. So let's do the C major scale, C major pentatonic specifically. C, D, E, G, A, C. So C, D, E, G, and A are our different notes. Okay. So we go, okay, do we have an E in the scale? Could we do a position built off of the E? Yeah. So we could go from E to G. Okay. Then we have an A and a C, and then a D and an E, and then you could do a G and an A again, right? So it looks very similar to what we were doing when we were in the G major pentatonic. It's just instead of a B, we have a C. The other notes are the same. So that's kind of an interesting thing, but that pattern, it's hard to see because we're doing it off the open string, but that pattern, if you pretended the open string was a fret, you could say it was the one that we're going index, pinky, index, pinky, index, ring, which is built off of the third note of the scale. So we did that same finger formation, index, pinky, index, index, ring, when we were in G major, built off of the third note of that scale. So all of a sudden, you can start to recognize that you learn these patterns in one key, then those positions will work in the other key as long as you know the set of notes, right? So if you know it's supposed to be C, D, E, G, A, B. Okay, so now we're doing C. So we did C, D, E. We started on the third note of the scale. Okay, now we're going to go to a G, right? Because the next note in the scale would have been a G. So if we started on a G, but now we're playing the C major pentatonic scale, we'd still use the set of notes that we did before, which is C, D, E, G, and A. So we're starting on a G. Our next note will be an A. Then we have a C after that, a D, an E, a G, an A, and then our pinky can get a C here. So what I'm doing here is middle pinky, then going down a string, middle pinky, going down a string, index pinky, going down a string, and then index pinky. So that's starting from a fifth away from the root. So if we're doing a C major pentatonic, that's starting on a G. And if you notice that pattern, when we started, when we were in the key of G, doing G major pentatonic scale, but we started on the fifth away from the root over here, it's the same exact shape. Middle pinky, index pinky. Versus here it was middle pinky, index pinky, right? So these shapes, as long as you know which note of the scale you're moving from, so like in if you're starting from a fifth away from the root, which is, it's not the fifth note of the scale. It's confusing with the pentatonic scales because they don't account for the intervals if you just go with the letters in order. But if you know your major scale, you would know what I mean by it's a fifth away from the root. So anyway, It's that same shape, right? So now we're still in the C major pentatonic scale. Let's go up to A and start. What happens when we go up to A, which is the 5th fret on the E string? You end up with index, pinky, index, ring, index, ring, index, ring. And that looks familiar, right? Because when we're in G major, it would be starting a 6th away from the root. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, G, A, B, C, D, E, right? So we did it here, but in C major, you'd be starting on an A, but doing the same finger pattern. Okay? So now that we've got that, what's the next note of our C major pentatonic? Well, we did C, D, E, G. Oh, the next one's A, right? So after G, we go to A. We did that one, sorry. After A, we start over at C. Okay, so this is just our major pentatonic shape. So if you remember it from when we did the G scale, that should give us the right notes, going middle pinky, down a string, index pinky, index pinky, index ring. That should give us the right notes. Let's see if it does. If I start on my middle finger on C, we already know that's one of the good notes. We're looking for C, D, E, G, A, and then continuing with those 5 notes only. So we have a C here with our middle finger, a D with our pinky. We go down to the next string, we have an E. Then we have a G. Then we have an A. Then we have another C. Then we have a D and an E. And all of those are notes in the C major pentatonic. So that's our root position pattern. And remember when we did it in G, it was down here, but it was the same fingers going down, same geometric shape. So that's the G major pentatonic. But then here, when we start on a C and do the same finger shapes, we get the C major pentatonic scale. Okay? And then after that, we really just have one left, but I'm going to go 2 so that you can see the way that first one started. So after we go from C, if we go to the second note of our pentatonic scale, so we're in the C major pentatonic scale, and that was our root position. Well, now we can go up 2 frets, and we end up starting on a D note. So this is going to be the pattern kind of like when we were on G, when we were doing the G major pentatonic, but we started on an A. We did this pattern. So let's just take that pattern and move it up here to where we're starting on a D note, because that's the second note of the C major pentatonic scale. So it's going to be middle pinky, go down a string, middle pinky, go down a string, middle pinky, go down a string, index pinky. Okay? Okay. So that's still the same shape. And these shapes go in the same order. It's just you can't always start on the root, depending on what scale you're in. I hope that's not too confusing. I have a feeling I confused some people here. But hopefully I'll kind of understand what's going on there. But that's how you can use those patterns. And then we're back to the one we were on. So this is a third away from the root. So we're doing C major pentatonic. We're starting on the E. And I say put your index finger there, because when we start on the third note of the scale, the pattern goes index, pinky, index, ring, index, ring. So we had already done this one down here, but now we're doing it with our fingers so that you can kind of see the shape. Okay, so basically, if you learn one of the pentatonic scales and you learn all 5 shapes, you can apply those to the other pentatonic scales just by knowing the order of the notes on one string. So it's hard to like put that into words, but basically just by knowing where the pentatonic scale, every note that could happen in that pentatonic scale on one string kind of tells you where to start these positions. So once again, if you're starting on the root of the scale, that's the shape you want to use. If you're starting on the second note of the scale, that's the shape you want to use. If you're starting on the third note of the scale or the third from the root, that's the one you want to use. If you're starting on the fifth from the root, not technically the fifth note of the scale, then that's the finger pattern you want to use. But basically that gives you the way to play every single note in each position of any pentatonic scale. And then it's just a matter of doing this with the other scales and kind of playing through it and just stumbling upon different connections that you can make theory-wise between all this stuff. But yeah, it's a little bit of a theory-heavy lesson, so I hope y'all are still with me. Okay, so once we do that, you can use that to solo, right? So let's just go back to our original scale where we were doing the G major pentatonic scale. And let's use those positions to improvise. So right now I'm improvising in the first position, the open position. Okay, and then at some point I may want to go to this. This is the root position, but it's the second one we covered in G major. And I'm improvising using the using that set of notes, but it's easy to find them because I practiced going up and down the scale a whole bunch, right? And then you can create bass lines out of this kind of stuff too. Just by adding rhythm and repeating certain notes and playing some of them a little bit out of order. Okay, then we can go to our position built from the second note of the scale. Then we go to the next one. Okay, and then we can go to the next position. And we go to the last one. Right? So now what I want to do is not tell you that I'm doing that, but just show you that I'm doing that while I'm playing, right? So then you're trying to figure out how to connect them linearly so you can go back and forth between those positions smoothly. And that's kind of where having that idea of what is your scale on one string connects the dots between the positions. But also, if you want to jump up from a low position to a high position, you just need to know what the first note is that you're doing and then remember like where it is within the scale. So like if I'm in root position, then we'll go to fifth position. But that's how you can practice this, is basically just moving back and forth between those. And you have all of this access to all of those notes without having to move a position. So does that make any sense to you guys? Or is it a little bit kind of just tricky to figure out what's going on with that? If that's the case, I'd recommend learning a major scale first then going and taking a look at the pentatonic video that I did earlier this week, and go ahead and just play through all the positions and just kind of get used to that with one scale, and then come back to this video and you might see how it connects over to the other scales. So I hope that helps a little bit, and just let me know if you have questions. I'm sure y'all might have some questions to put in the comments. But I'm going to play a couple of songs for you just for fun. If you have any questions about anything not related to pentatonics and just questions that you have about the U-bass in general or strings, please let me know. And I see I got one comment from, is it E.G.? I don't know how to pronounce your name. I'm sorry if I'm butchering it. But thank you for tuning in if you're still here. But yeah, I'm going to play a little bit of another song that pretty much, it's not all pentatonics, but it relies on some of these patterns and some facet, and then breaking out of it and thinking more linearly with it. Linearly with it. Okay. Okay, so feel free to ask questions about anything related to U-bass. I'm not seeing any new questions or anything show up in the chat, but I hope y'all are enjoying this anyway. With that song, it was more using G major, and then it kind of changed to another string, to another scale every now and then, but I was mostly just doing the G major scale in its entirety when I was coming up with the melody for that. But when I'm on the G chord specifically, a lot of it end up being notes from the first two positions. So check this out. This part, those two notes are from the second position, right? And then the open strings are coming from this open position that we went over at first. So all of those are kind of coming from the scale. Yes, I'm using my pinky to play that note. If I played the ring finger for that note, it would be more obvious that I'm using that position. So on one string, oops, you can kind of see that I was doing a lot of pentatonics while I was over the G chord. You could stay with the G pentatonic scale and make something up even when you do like a 1-4-5 progression. Whoops, that's not pentatonic. Yeah, so you can kind of improvise using that over a root note that's also in that position if you want to. But hopefully that makes some sense, and hopefully that helps out a little bit. I don't see anybody asking any questions, so I hope y'all are able to. I hope the chat's working. But I'm gonna go ahead and go. So I hope you have a good one, and I will see y'all next time. have fun working on those pentatonic scales, and let me know in the comments later if you have any questions about it or anything that you want more explanation on. Thank you, and I'll see y'all next time.